Hello, hello. You gonna introduce us or to us? Come on, we're recording, dude.
Man, I thought you were gonna be like, "Hello, hello, my name is Billy Boy." He's just left it.
You know what?
Like,
Let's leave it in. It's funny.
when's he gonna do the?
But yes, I'm Billy Boy Bacon. It works
Hey, my
out.
name is Woodman. Boy, we're up to a great start.
This is gonna be fantastic. This already feels super ADHD, which is fantastic for our topic
Oh,
today.
amazing!
That's
Yeah,
such a
yeah.
great comedy beat at the
Speaking
beginning.
of segue right into the content there.
Yeah.
So about ADHD. Oh,
Okay. Let's regain some composure here.
yes, yes. Today we want to talk about how Christians ought to look at matters of mental health. Last episode, we were talking about mental health as it pertains to disorders of mood, anxiety, depression, mostly depression. This time, we want to talk about developmental disabilities, things that are permanent and come, either early on in childhood or potentially from birth. How do we address people that are affected mentally by these things? There are some people who are born blind. There are some people born with various deformities in the body, but the brain just feels like it's treated a very different way by everybody in the world, and also, unfortunately, sometimes by people in the church. And we want to just kind of clear the air on all of that.
So, in my own experience, right, I have ADHD, a specific subtype called ADD-HS, so attention deficit disorder with hyperactivity syndrome. And we can break down, well, what does that mean? Attention deficit. Well, attention deficit means it is extremely difficult for my mind to focus on anything. I can't, like, an example where I have a limitation is most people can be in a classroom and somebody drops a pen, and then they can see where the pen went and then get back to work, right? They can refocus their mind on what they need to do. Somebody with ADHD or any of its subvarieties, especially attention deficit, might have a harder time getting back to doing the work from looking at where the pen went or where the sound came from. And unfortunately, I experience that pretty often, is just cases where it's very difficult for my mind to refocus on things. One of the key factors of like ADHD and its circles of things is that the focus is less built upon what needs to be done. So it's not a priority list. It's instead a list of interests. And so it's much easier for somebody with ADHD to focus on something they're interested in, like a video game or whatever. But it's very difficult for them to maintain interest on or focus on something, even if they know it really needs to be done. And that's a factor that's often misunderstood. And I don't know if you have anything to say on that.
Yeah, I think one of the best ways to address the topic of ADHD, the topic of, well, really that and autism, is to go back to the brain and see what's going on inside there.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that needs to be understood about both of these disabilities is that they originate with part of the brain being underdeveloped.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a part of your brain that manages each of your different functions. And one set of functions ends up being severely limited when one part of the brain does not grow in all of the way on time. The reason I say on time is there's actually a lot of people whose brain will eventually grow to the size it should have been when they were younger. But you'll start to see a lot of trouble in the life of a person who, for example, has an underdeveloped executive center. That is the center that manages tasks, memory, emotional regulation, and so on, at a time in their life where all of their peers, other kids, already have that much more developed.
Mm-hmm.
So The primary center that is affected by ADHD and one of the primary centers that's affected by autism, it's kind of a Venn diagram, literally, within the brain, is that executive center. And it's got 7 functions that it runs. And usually all of this stuff happens subconsciously. And that is, see if I can remember it off the top of my head, emotional regulation, starting tasks, maintaining tasks, stopping tasks, checking to see if you've done a task correctly, writing things to your memory, and then reading from your memory. All of these things happen automatically in the brain of a person who is fully developed in that executive center. And this is all information that I got from Dr. Russell Barkley, who is one of the cutting edge researchers on these topics.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what happens, so you could say that it's a little bit like a secretary of your brain. All of your conscious thought happens further back in your brain, but up near the front is this office that's doing all of these things subconsciously, checking when is it time to start a task? How well am I doing it? Have I done it the way that I needed to? Managing the emotions. The secretary's job is to take weight off of the conscious brain, just managing all of the files, all of the memories, and just generally getting stuff done without you having to be intentional about it. What will happen in a person who is underdeveloped in that center is that they will struggle with all 7 executive functions, those 7 that I just listed, because that part of their brain is not doing it automatically. That doesn't mean that they're completely incapable of doing those things, but it means that they have to dedicate conscious attention to them. They have to use the thinking part of their brain to do what you can normally do without thinking. And the consequence of this is that while a person considered neurotypical is able to think and do something subconsciously at the same time, turn something over in their hands while talking to a person, or remember to get off the right stop from the bus while they're thinking, a person with ADHD is not capable of doing this. They have to think about, this is my stop, I am going to get off at this time, and they have to keep that thought maintained for as long as it takes to get to their stop. So their back brain, their conscious brain, ends up being much busier and therefore overworked. This leads to exhaustion. And you'll often find one of the big symptoms for people with ADHD is that they are constantly tired because of this. So their brain is partly compensating, but it comes at a cost, and the cost is spending a lot of brain power.
Definitely. And one of the key things with that is it often leads to mental fatigue, and that mental fatigue then sometimes turns into a literal fatigue, where it is genuinely difficult for somebody with these conditions to maintain endurance in certain fields. And it can definitely be difficult in that regard. Something that I did want to bring up that I find kind of amusing is when we look at symptoms between ADHD and autism, is that the Venn diagram between their two symptoms it's almost a circle. And the wildest part is that the one that affects your actual like neurology, like how chemicals react in your body the most, is ADHD. A lot of people would think it's autism, but it's actually ADHD.
Yes. So we don't fully understand autism right now. Actually, the first person who was ever diagnosed with it is still alive today. So this is some relatively newer research. But while we're not able to necessarily explain why it is, we are able to explain what it's like. And what happens for a lot of people who have autism, and they will very, very frequently have ADHD as well, it's a comorbidity, is we are describing a person whose conscious brain has fallen into certain patterns in order to make up for their subconscious brain being underdeveloped. To put it in terms of an airplane, because the autopilot doesn't work, the pilot teaches himself a bunch of tricks to manage all of the tasks that are necessary for the flight in order to make up for just how much work he's going to have to do manually handling the plane for all 8 hours of the flight, or, for the person who has autism, 8 hours of a day. And so you're going to see some very different mental landscape and very different connection points in the brain of a person who has to use their intellectual center all the time. And people with autism are often described as very smart. Well, the brain isn't exactly a muscle, but it works a lot like one in that the sections that you use regularly get, not only stronger, but also more complex. So the density of neurons and, well, there's several things. I'm not sure how deep we want to get into that. But basically, the way that their brain looks, their thinking brain, is going to be different from anybody else in a similar fashion to a person who is deaf getting much better at using their eyes, or a person who's blind getting much better at using their ears. Because they're missing the one thing, they make up for it using another thing. It's not a superpower, but rather it's a more complete use of the part of you that you do have full access to. And so I guess just as one small example, people with autism, when you get a cross-section of your brain, you'll see that they trim fewer things. They trim fewer neurons. We're always constantly making connections between parts of our brain, but our brain will go back kind of with hedge clippers and trim those back, basically pruning unnecessary connections. But those connections are not pruned in a person with autism, and that can have the positive effect of making them learn things very, very well and getting instant pattern recognition. Even on patterns that might not be immediately obvious to other people, they become instinctual. But the downside to that can also be that you'll find patterns in things that aren't there. I forget the name of that.
I forget what it's called too, but I know exactly what you're talking about.
So, there are some people who talk about autism and they'll say, well, it's not really a disability because you get some nice things out of it. And that's not true. It's not true at all. There is a part of you that is not working as it is supposed to. It's just that another part of you is working overtime to make up for it. And it teaches itself a couple of tricks and begins to behave in a certain way that can be recognized from person to person. So that's one theory for how we can talk about autism, is that when your brain is compensating for your underdeveloped areas, and we don't know why they underdevelop, could have something to do with nurture, could have something to do with nature, could be all the way from birth or even genetics. That is still under research. But when you compensate for it in this one particular way, and a whole bunch of other people also do that, that makes you all diagnosable with this same name for it, namely autism.
And something that's kind of important to think about with that is that, so I guess I can speak from some experience here. So I have Asperger's syndrome documented in my medical record, but it's not a diagnosis, so I don't claim to be autistic per se, though basically everybody in my life is like, you're clearly autistic. But what you're talking about is, you mentioned sometimes people argue, hey, it's not really that much of a disability if you're getting all these kind of really cool benefits out of it. And it's like, well, when we look at the actual realities of it, for instance, we look at schooling, right? Because we can get data out of schooling. We can see that a lot of the gifted kids are actually special needs. And so once they start leaving the high school, early college age, suddenly they need a lot of help in order to keep up with school, because their brain is having to work overtime already just to function at the level that it already was. And then you're adding so much more stress and strain to it that it starts to break down and can be very stressful and difficult to deal with in that regard.
Right. But another gifted kid burnout is something they call it.
Yeah. Another good thing to think about is, okay, why would God let this type of condition form, right? Because some people will try and use that as an argument against God, that, how can you let people be born or develop these kinds of intensive disabilities and stuff? And it's like, okay, well, because it would be really boring in a world without it. I'm gonna be for real. a lot of innovation and creation and some of the things that really drive humanity forward comes from the unusual thinking patterns, the abstracted thinking patterns that you might see in people with these conditions. And so
Fire off some examples.
I can hardly think of any off the top of my head, but
Albert Einstein, Nikola
Yeah.
Tesla. Let's see, the guy who made the
most famous inventors and important like people in like astronomy and science is definitely with these conditions.
The other interesting thing about ADHD, what it does to you, and this will often be, again, common in people with autism, this particular set of neurodevelopmental disorders. And by the way, I'm talking about people who actually have it here. Like if you put their brain under an MRI machine, you would actually be able to detect this stuff, not people who have decided from scrolling on the internet.
Yeah.
Pew Research put out something recently saying anywhere up to 60% of all mental health information given on social media is incorrect. So we are talking about the diagnosable side of this. And by the way, if you don't know if you have it, I would highly recommend getting diagnosed. I would also highly recommend not saying that you do until you have some pretty good
like for instance, I don't claim to be
doctor's
autistic,
recommendation,
even though it's like literally in my medical record. And the reason why it wasn't a diagnosis was because the expert on Asperger's that I went to, because this was before Asperger's syndrome was added back into the autism spectrum disorder diagnosis. The specialist, he was literally like, you're high functioning enough, giving you the diagnosis would actually hinder you more than help you. And so I was like, okay, cool. That's fine, I guess. I mean, I could probably use getting diagnosed with it. But notice how I'm hesitant to even claim to be autistic, even though it's pretty obvious.
And that's something that people in this generation should learn from.
Yeah.
Is just be incredibly careful about that.
Another
so the other thing. Sure. Man, I don't know.
Yeah, either I just wanted to quickly mention, because you mentioned the brain scans and stuff. It was like, what we're talking about are conditions that are often categorized as neurodivergent. Well, what does that mean? So there's neurotypical and neurodivergent. Neurotypical is basically, this is the subset of most of humanity that we can expect medical procedures to work this way, this way, this way, medications to do this thing, and this thing, right? So on and so forth. Neurodivergents often throw a massive wrench in that because our neurology is fundamentally different. An example is with ADHD meds, or like an ADHD person. Often, stimulants would make us tired or sleepy instead of actually waking us up, because the way our neurology is wired. And that's not always true of ADHD. There are many different varieties and stuff, and it can happen in a lot of different ways. But that's a very common thing. And so that's why if, say, you're a regular person and you go to your doctor and they're trying to prescribe you a medication that you might need, and they might ask, hey, do you have any like conditions that would fall under these categories or things like that? They're asking because they want to make sure they're prescribing you a med that they can expect to work the way that it's supposed to, because a lot of meds will invert their effects on neurodivergence, and that can be dangerous.
Yes. And for people who do have these various, by the way, I am using the word disability, and that's often a term that people are scared to use because they think that it might have something to do with your value as a person. But of course, we as Christians understand that we all have what we call the imago Dei. We are all made in the image of God. Mm-hmm. Our value is entirely separate from how well our brain or our body works. Mm-hmm. And that's why I'm comfortable using a term like disability so freely.
And I definitely use it sometimes when I'm getting like nerdy medical. I do, and the main reason why I've been using other terms and stuff in this context is mostly to give a little bit more vocabulary for our audience, but also because I'm referencing it into particular circumstances where they might say it that way, right?
Sure.
It definitely is disability. Like, for instance, when I got out of high school, I didn't realize that I was legally classified as disabled since I was like 5 years old. I didn't know that because it just wasn't obvious to me in the paperwork that my like insurance companies and stuff would send me. that did help me get some loans to try and do a little bit of college. No, not loans, but grants. You know, but it ultimately came down to a reality of like, yeah, I am disabled. For instance, I don't work. I have lots of other conditions and stuff that are on top of the neurodivergent stuff. Like, for instance, I have post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm not a veteran or anything. But the reality is that a lot of working environments become extremely difficult for people with these conditions because it is a disability. It does mean you aren't functioning the way that a quote-unquote regular person is, and it becomes very difficult in order for that to meld into the way our society is built. And so I think it is good that we have a push for mental health. I think it's bad that it's now being glorified as if it's some kind of proud thing to be neurodivergent or something. And it's like, no, you shouldn't be taking pride in it. Just understand if you have it, you have it, and you need to address it and work with it in a positive way.
Right. Yeah, some of it has been a little bit absorbed into the greater pride movement, I would even say. Which, man, anytime that it seems to me that people try and speak for the disabled community who are not actually members of it, it almost universally results in damage to the reputation and social ability of that group. Please don't presume to speak for people who are diagnosable if you're not. I mean, depending on what kind of disability or disorder a person has, they may have trouble speaking for themselves. For example, people with social anxiety are going to have a hard time being public speakers. But we need to be able to express what's actually going on with us in order to get the accommodations that we need. It is not a matter of self-identification. It is not a matter of identity, really, but it's a matter of getting
self-advocacy.
What we need from society. Exactly.
Yeah.
So the other thing, finally looping all the way around, back to it, is people with autism and ADHD, but especially ADHD, have an impaired interoception center. Interoception is what I would call the dashboard of the brain. Basically, your body knows what it needs and what's going on with it. Your nerves carry all of that signal down through your spine, up into your brain stem, and to your brain. The part of your brain that interprets all of those signals and decides what to do about it is the interoception center. And this is again from Dr. Barkley. The trouble that happens when the interoception center is underdeveloped throughout childhood or underdeveloped for a person's entire life is that every urge or instinct that the body tries to send to the brain will be diminished or even missing. So think about everything that your body might tell you that you might want to know and act on in a more or less timely fashion. For example, are you hot? Are you cold? Are you wet? Are you dry? Do you need to pee? Do you need to defecate? Are you hungry, thirsty, tired? Are you in pain? Are you uncomfortable? All of these things are things that the dashboard of the brain should be telling you, but it's like the wires are a little loose and the needles don't always move as far as they should or at all to tell you how fast you're going or how much gas you have in the tank. And so a lot of the more baffling symptoms of ADHD and autism trace back to this one center, where people will say, why do you sit like that? You sit so funny. Well, because it's temporarily comfortable to sit like that. It gives you a little bit of dopamine. But you'll say, doesn't that hurt to sit funny? And the answer is yes, actually it does. But the brain doesn't know. And so they'll get up and both of their legs will be asleep and they'll be in a lot of pain once the blood starts flowing back there. But they don't notice that small low-grade pain because the brain is simply not talking to them about it. People with ADHD are a lot more prone to getting kidney stones And kidney stones develop for a variety of reasons, but one of the reasons is that if you don't urinate when you need to, you don't go when you got to go, that will eventually start causing buildup that turns into kidney stones. Well, if you don't know when you need to urinate because your brain isn't properly reporting it to you, guess who's going to be more susceptible to kidney stones?
Yeah.
There will also be a level of worry, even sometimes misdiagnosis, that people who have ADHD especially may also have an eating disorder, because people will notice that they don't eat enough or they don't eat regularly. And the problem is their body isn't telling them they're hungry.
Mm-hmm. Like I experience that these days. I didn't always, but my body does not tell me when I'm hungry, which is why I'm super big. It's one of the reasons I'm super big on mindfulness and being aware of what's going on. In the last episode, we talked about HALT quite a bit. I use that partly just to deal with my symptoms, to help me be aware of what's going on in my body. Something I also remembered is, because you were talking about like kidney stones and stuff, is it's extremely common for children with ADHD, and this can happen for a lot of reasons, but it's very common with children with ADHD to bedwet and well until they're like 11 or 12 even, which is relatively abnormal. Most children kind of stop that by 7 or 8.
Right. It ends up being very concerning for the parent.
Mm-hmm. And it can be. So it's just something to think about, in the sense that, like, yeah, you'll get a lot of weird little symptoms, things that people might not even necessarily realize are all that weird. But it's things like that where it's like, okay, you can use that as a little bit of a warning sign. Admittedly, that's a particular symptom that's common in a lot of different stuff. But
sure,
it's very common in ADHD, just because the body is pretty bad at telling you with ADHD. Often the body is pretty bad at telling you when you actually need to use the bathroom. So another example of that will be either, you might wet the bed when you were younger, but it could also be a case of, even as an adult, you won't feel the need to go pee until you really need to go pee. Like,
right.
And that's something that I experience, is like my body won't tell me that I could use going to the bathroom until it's like, you need to go to the bathroom now.
Right. And that's actually when it's when your brain stem and the surrounding area are finally noticing that you're in physical pain. Like yeah. You actually need to pee so bad that it actually hurts. And that's when your pain nerves kick in, because that's a whole different section of the brain saying, hey, I hurt, I need to do something. And then finally the other part of your brain comes online and says, oh, shucks. Yeah, okay, I know why. But, it doesn't wake up until then, as it were.
Yeah.
I noticed the thing that you said you do is mindfulness. And that's consistent with this way of viewing, this cutting edge way of viewing ADHD. You have to be consciously thinking about your needs in order for your brain to recognize that you have your needs. For anybody else, that isn't the case, but mindfulness is a practice of saying, I am going to intentionally consider whatever it is. I'm going to intentionally consider, when was the last time I ate? When was the last time I drank? When was the last time I slept? Sleep dysphagia, which is sleeping at the wrong times, is super common in people with both of these disabilities, because they don't know when they're tired. And by the way, the more things that are on your thinking brain's plate, your intellectual brain, the conscious processing, the more that it will tune out the rest of your brain. So, you might get a little hungry and then look over at the clock and realize that it's lunchtime. But if you're really focused on something, your intellectual brain will actually stop listening to your interoception entirely. And you might end up working all the way through lunch and not even realize. Mm-hmm. Which is why one of the ways to help accommodate yourself is to have a clock in every room, to put a wristwatch on, to put something directly in your sight that will remind you of certain things that you need. That's called externalizing. And it's important because internally, your mind will not be reminding itself of the things that everybody else's mind reminds them of.
Yeah. And it's one of those things where it's like, why do we bring that up as a reality? Because it's important to remember, as an individual that might be suffering these symptoms or suffering these conditions, especially if you weren't necessarily entirely aware of it, it is good to do that as a practice, because it helps you. We bring it up because we want to make sure that there's not a stigma against, like, hey, if your brain is functioning abnormally, you cannot be held to an expectation to just know what time it is, or just know what's going on, or just know that you need to use the bathroom or something, right? So setting little alarms and stuff for yourself is a completely valid way of doing things. Or having tools in a toolbox, that's why I like that analogy so much, is you're having tools to mitigate your symptoms in order to experience life at a higher quality of life.
Right.
And that's very important.
You know, something is missing. So you're basically, I mean, it will never be as visible. And some people might wish that it was more visible, just so that people could understand the kind of life that they're living. If you're crippled, you may need a wheelchair. If you're missing a leg, even if you were born missing a leg, you may need a prosthesis. If you have a part of your brain that's missing, you may need external mechanisms to help fill in the functions of those parts of you that are missing in the brain. It really is no different. And if somebody were to tell you at your workplace, yeah, we're just not going to make it wheelchair accessible,
it's kind of ridiculous.
The law will go after them.
Yeah.
And they should. The society should go after them. That we should be appalled by that idea. Or to say, yeah, you can come to work, you who have, you know, a missing leg. You can come to work as yourself, but don't bring your prosthetic. We would never say that to a person whose disability is physical. We ought not to say that to anybody whose disability is part of their brain. You know.
And it's unfortunately very common that things like that are said in the workplace. I'll give a little bit of an example. Admittedly, this was a PTSD related symptom. So I have post-traumatic stress disorder, which, you know, I experienced trauma in my younger years. I kind of mentioned in the previous episode that, you know, I was abused as a child, and that ultimately developed me PTSD. However, what ended up as a result of it is that I handle stress differently than somebody who would normally handle stress. My body has a lot harder of a time offloading stress. And so when I was working my security job, I was getting really stressed out, like really, really bad when I was working security. It was so much so that myself, as a 21-year-old, was starting to get gray hairs in my beard. And my own boss noticed it and was like, oh, you're getting stressed. Like, that's abnormal for a 21-year-old to be getting gray hair. Like,
right.
Don't feel afraid. I definitely want to encourage people not to feel afraid to recognize when things just aren't working for them. And it can be crushing sometimes. It can be very difficult to deal with. But, like, that's why I'm currently unemployed. I'm mostly just trying to do YouTube, trying to make something out of it, because I thrive in a creative environment. And it's a matter of, if you start noticing stuff like that in your life, you have to try and recognize what's going on underneath that might be going on in your head, in your mind. And that's not to say that it's not real. It's very real.
It's just hidden behind your skull.
Mm-hmm. And
you know, if you hurt your knee and it's not a bone poking out of the knee,
yeah,
it's still a hurt knee. It doesn't matter. It's behind the kneecap.
Yeah. And so it's just like, you have to recognize that. And that was one of the reasons I left my security job. I was being so stressed that it was, you know, beginning to actually harm me.
Right.
And soon thereafter, my beard hair color came back and I'm feeling great. And so it's like, yeah, it was the right move.
Right.
So figured I'd add just a little personal story there that can be hopefully
Yeah.
inspiring.
One of the things, I mean, autism, the name of it doesn't immediately bring something to mind because most people wouldn't have any guesses as to the etymology of it. But of course, ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactive Disorder. And that's what it's currently called in the
Yeah.
what's the DSM Diagnostic Statistical Manual.
Yeah, the DSM-5.
Right. That name has some unfortunate implications because it is focused not on the symptoms nor even on the cause of the disability, but it is focused entirely on the way that you are an inconvenience to others.
Yeah.
I think that's terribly unfortunate. This is something that Dr. Barkley talks about as well. He's considered, he's pushed the scientific community to consider calling it executive function disorder
Mm-hmm.
because that's the part of the brain that's disabled and needs treated. Attention deficit sounds like you don't pay attention. And if you're not seeing under the hood at all, it would very much seem that the person is not paying attention. And that's the primary way that you will inconvenience other people and potentially draw their negative attention towards you is when you are not giving them or giving your work perhaps the amount of focus that they believe it deserves.
Mm-hmm.
But the reason that you will be manifesting this inconvenient behavior for others is because the part of your brain that starts and maintains tasks is broken. And furthermore, you will be facing a host of potential distractions as your body is not getting what it needs. And the reason your body isn't getting what it needs is because it's not telling your brain to fulfill its needs. So, if we understand the way that development normally works, think about a little kid, maybe 3 years old. If you see that kid dancing from one leg to the other and looking, vaguely uncomfortable, what would your diagnosis be? What would you suggest?
I mean, I trying to onlook that, I would guess that the kid probably needs to use the bathroom or something. Like he's just trying to keep in motion so he doesn't feel that pain.
Right. The kid has not fully developed his interoception center, and this is something that happens with every child at a certain part of their development. So you tell the kid, hey, you need to go potty? He goes, oh yeah. And then off he goes. And you give this, positive external reinforcement, hey, listen to your body. And the brain starts to draw that connection. Okay, when I'm doing this with my body, I need to listen to this part of my body and then act on it. You do that a handful of times, and eventually the kid is able to, without any external reinforcement, recognize when they need to urinate and always go on time. Another example, say that a kid is acting really grouchy, lethargic, just not fun to be around, not having a fun time. They might be getting a little weepy, a little teary-eyed for no apparent reason. It's not like something bad has happened. What's going on there?
I honestly don't have a great guess, but what I do know is that I would notice that and I would want to look into it and try and figure out, using some diagnostic of okay, what's going on? Is he upset by something, or did he trip and fall and
Sure.
just nobody
Let's
noticed?
say that you had been observing him for the last hour and nothing bad has happened. Nothing that would upset him has happened. But he's just been getting grouchier and more lethargic as time goes by.
I would check if he's hungry, if he's tired,
Right.
Because honestly, halt is a great default.
Exactly.
It's just okay, the kid's not feeling great. What's going on? And it could be that he hasn't eaten in a while. It could be that it's time for a nap.
Right. And that's exactly it.
That's something that I wanted to say real quick is our culture, especially in the West, like the UK, the US, Japan, like all over what can commonly be considered the Western world, there's some kind of culture against like the idea of adults napping for some reason. And it's like, okay, children do it, old people do it. Why are adults not allowed to nap, especially if they could use one? It's fantastic as a tool for people with like ADHD who might struggle with managing their sleep cycles. Like that's something that I've always felt was kind of weird, is why is there some stigma or culture against it? It doesn't make sense to me.
And that's, by the way, something that people with autism and ADHD will frequently need, is because they've already spent as much energy mentally as you might spend all day in like the first 3 hours of their day, they might need more sleep.
Yeah.
It's not the end of the world. It's just that might be what they need to do, because being awake for the same amount of time as you does not mean that they've spent the same amount of energy. They've spent significantly more.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, for that kid, as you correctly guessed, they might be hungry, but chances are they're tired. And what you can do, of course, is to say, hey, buddy, hey, how you doing? Do you need to go down for a nap? Kid goes, yeah, I do. And they go off and they have their nap and they feel fine. And they remember that because it was an external reminder that helps them grow the part of their brain that checks if they're tired.
Mm-hmm.
But we get hit with a double whammy for people with ADHD, because not only is their body failing to report when it's tired, but also emotional regulation is part of the executive function center. And so you can get this place where you're feeling really out of whack, stressed, grouchy, or even starting to get into a really bad headspace, just because the part of your brain that is supposed to keep all of that in check just isn't. And then the part of your brain that talks to your body to see, okay, do I need to do something to recharge? Do I need to sleep? Do I need to eat? Is also not talking to you. And so other people will see the results of this. They don't see what's the cause. So they'll say, no, this person always seems to be in a bad mood. They're never paying attention. And the focus ends up being on how you are making it hard for other people, without talking about, all right, if I'm diagnosed with ADHD, there's a reason for that. I'm not in control of it. And actually, it hurts a lot worse to be me than the minor inconvenience that I'm probably causing you. Mm-hmm. So that's just something to keep an eye on as we talk about any kind of neurodevelopmental disability. Remember not to focus the conversation on how other people feel, but remember to focus the conversation on what's going on in the head and how can we address it. I mean, somebody is constantly showing up late to work. There might be certain assumptions that you could make about them. And so somebody says, yeah, so-and-so, they get to the bottom floor of the building, but then they always take their time getting up to the office, so they're always like 5 minutes late. Well, if that guy comes out of the elevator and he's got 2 prosthetic legs, you're going to think the person who was complaining about him being late was, and he should.
The funny, like, an interesting thing. Oh, goodness. Okay, I'm having a classic ADHD symptom of just the train of thought as I'm trying to say it just vanishes.
That would be the maintaining tasks center.
Yeah. So that, yeah, I'm sorry. I completely lost my train of thought.
Sure. Well, feel free to butt in with it. So we've talked about how, well, man, we've hit a lot of topics.
Oh, yeah.
But let's talk about what people who have these conditions can do to help themselves. And that might also contribute to a conversation, too, on how other people can accommodate people who have these neurodevelopmental disabilities.
And I remember what I was wanting to say is when we look at things like these disabilities and stuff, is we have to consider it's not necessarily, don't view it as an excuse, right? It shouldn't be used to excuse one's behavior per se. It can be used as a way of demonstrating empathy and like, okay, I understand why this maybe slipped up a few times here and there. But it's important for us to take initiative as people with these conditions to consider how we are affecting other people and how we can manage our symptoms, because it's going to lead to a better quality of life. You don't need to make it an excuse. You don't need to make yourself a victim of the disability, but merely understand you have it and adapt to it. That's the greatest quality of humanity, is our ability to adapt.
I have a friend who I have pretty much never been able to hug before. And I am quite a touchy person. I love to hug my friends. But he did me a big favor by explaining the first time that we were in close physical proximity that he couldn't do it and why he couldn't do it. And the reason is that he has a sensory processing disorder, meaning that the feeling of being touched by somebody else, especially like compression, translates basically to excruciating pain. Like it's just deeply, deeply uncomfortable. And so he just told me about that. He's like, yeah, so that's why I can't. And I have never had a problem with that ever since, or ever felt bad about it, me for myself, because I knew what was going on from the get-go. Now, disclosing your disability,
you don't always
can definitely have mixed results.
Yeah. It's maybe not always the best move, but it is important, especially with like your friends.
It is a tool in the toolbox.
Yeah. An example is, for instance, I have sensory issues. So I am light sensitive. So my eyes just use more light than normal. So I have to wear sunglasses even at night most of the time. Like it's it's that to that degree. I only use my clear ones when I'm like with my computer and recording and stuff, just so people can see my eyes and feel more comfortable in that regard. And also so I don't have polarized glare with the screens. Then
and that's another overcompensation, by the way.
Yeah. And then I have
that.
Oh, go on.
Yeah, go ahead. I saw a study recently where they took a piece of brain tissue from a very young person with autism, and they did this with several people so that they could replicate the results. And they grew basically a micro brain, an organ from that swab of cells. And they just kind of saw, what does this pseudo brain, what sections is it growing bigger and smaller? And one thing they noticed was that the part of the brain that handles sensory inputs, light, sound, touch, smell, etc., was like 60% bigger, I think.
Yeah, it's pretty dramatic. Especially with autism.
So you are actually processing more information as your brain is trying to figure out how to cope with missing some sections. It ends up cranking up your senses all to 11. And that's why you'll have people who are like, I can't wear this sweater. Why not? It's scratchy. It's like, it's not. No, I can't do it at all. I will not be able to think if I'm wearing it, and so on. Or, I mean, shucks, I've met people who can hear the electricity in the walls.
I can.
Yeah.
Because I was going to continue. Like, I have hearing sensitivities on top of that. That's just a common thing in ADHD people, is to be able to hear, like, the electrical hum through the walls. Because it is at a frequency that people can regularly hear. However, the issue then becomes, in the neurotypical, part of the brain is able to take a variety of sounds and just dim them out, right? You know, you're like, this is sounds that don't matter, let me just mute them a little bit. And the ADHD brain struggles to do that. Same with the autism brain. It's like it's both like that neurodivergents tend to struggle with that executive function, and so you're still hearing all the noise, and I still hear all the electrical noise. I'm also just hearing sensitive in general, so some frequencies and sounds will cause me physical pain. For instance, babies crying will like literally cause me physical pain. Like it's that bad.
It's like yelling in a dog's ears.
Yeah, it's pretty awful sometimes.
Yeah.
But I also have touch sensitivity, and an example in an unfortunate reality of touch sensitivity, and this can be very embarrassing for people to admit, but I'm willing to be open about it because I think it's important to be open about it. I struggle to take showers because the water falling on my skin hurts me. Like it just makes me really uncomfortable. So that's why I prefer to take baths if possible. I'm also unfortunately a really big guy, so taking baths is almost never a possibility, and it becomes difficult to keep up on that hygiene. And so that's a place I struggle. And I wanted to say that because I want, especially our audience, to recognize that when there are struggles like that, it's not necessarily your fault. You do have to take it, you have to manage it. But we can also be empathetic and understand that it's not like you don't want to make it better. Like, it's not like you're not wanting it not to be that way. It's just you have to realize it is and adapt to it.
Right. So yeah, I mean, we have the two goals: one for people to understand and to show a greater amount of empathy, and one for people who have these kinds of things to be more self-aware and know what they can do about the various problems that they have.
Yeah.
You know, there's so many sad stories of like kids in public school. A kid wanders into a particular room or is taken into a particular classroom and just becomes outright violent. And they're like, what the heck is with this kid? And you know, they you know, they're talking about he's got behavioral problems. They're sending him to the principals. He gets in trouble. You know, he gets suspended. Same classroom next week. He's in that room and he just loses it. And somebody who knows a little bit about neurodevelopmental diseases says, wait a second. This only happens when this kid is in this classroom. And then they look closer at the classroom and they see, oh, this room has fluorescent lights. People who have overdeveloped sensory centers can hear fluorescent lights, and it sounds like a high-pitched screaming that drowns out all other noise.
Yeah, so it's like if anybody's ever experienced that ear ringing that like we associate with like the sounds of like, you know, a concussive explosion going off, right? Or just sometimes people just get it because of, you know, hearing damage or something.
If you have tinnitus.
Yeah. If you,
right, it's like walking into the tinnitus room.
It's that plus the sound of like a woman screaming in the distance. At least that's how I've always experienced it. It's
really disconcerting.
Yeah, it's just like it's a cacophony of dissonance that's just pain.
Also, that frequency of light ends up being painful to the eyes. So imagine you walk into a room and it's screaming at you very loudly, and also you can't even open your eyes all the way. It's blinding to you.
Yeah.
Would you behave in a way that is perfectly ordinary? Probably not. So for the kid, it's like, oh crap, he's not a poorly behaved kid. He's not a mean kid. He isn't violent by tendency or predisposition. Shucks, he just walked into a place that's like getting flashbanged and couldn't figure out what to do.
Yeah.
So that would be a great example of how empathy and education need very much to enter the educational space, the workplace, the church. Everywhere, people need to understand that this is going on. And we need to understand there's a significant portion of the population who has these kinds of issues. And across history, it would just be, you know, that's the broken kid. We're going to leave him out in the woods to die.
Yeah.
Nowadays, we can do a lot better.
And the other thing that's also important to remember is, like, you know, there's a bit of a debate going around sometimes, you know, you use that word loosely, where people are like, oh, are things causing these conditions? Or are we just noticing them more? Are we getting more broad with the definitions and stuff? And I think the simple answer is, you know, there could be some stuff that's like maybe causing it a little bit. But I think the more true reality is that it was always a certain percentage of the population. The human population is getting a lot bigger and a lot denser, which means you're going to notice a much higher population of these people because they're still within that percentage, right? And the other thing is we also understand these conditions better, which then leads us to reevaluating that percentage and maybe increasing or decreasing it as we understand these conditions better. And that's why we can see in the last 20 to 30 years people talking about, oh, having ADHD is a very sudden thing. Up until the 80s, ADHD was mostly just little boys who had behavioral issues in school that just couldn't focus. And suddenly our understanding of the condition changed. and we realized a lot more about it, and then we were able to recognize it a lot more in people. For instance, my grandmother was never diagnosed with it, but she gives all of the hallmark signs of having ADHD, especially from her schooling years. And so
Sure.
it's like, yeah,
And the
she
schooling
probably
environment is
yeah, she probably does have it.
the schooling environment is uniquely bad for this,
Oh,
because we never used to do schooling like this. But I mean, in first grade, you are expected to be as developed as a first grader is. In second grade, you're expected to be developed as a second grader. So what happens when you have a kid who is not as developed as a first grader is in all parts of their brain, and now they have to go on to second grade?
Yep.
You know, that regimented system. And, you know, remember, every part of your brain can grow. But I think that school has actually been making the problem worse, and perhaps making it bad enough to be diagnosable when it might have otherwise not been this way. Because
that definitely can happen.
remember how I mentioned you give that positive external feedback to kids to help them run their brains better. So
Schooling
take a
rarely
kindergarten,
does that.
right? Or it only does it at certain times. Take a kindergartner who's dancing from foot to foot. He doesn't know he needs to pee. You do. You just casually, hey man, you need to go to the bathroom? Oh yeah, I do, right? That's helping him grow his brain at the time where you expect his brain to still be growing in that area. You have a third grader like that, now he's getting yelled at. Now he ends up in the principal's office and his parents are getting, why the heck did he pee himself at his seat? What the heck is wrong with this kid? You're no longer getting positive external feedback. You're getting strongly negative feedback, or if you're lucky, just no feedback at all. And so you kind of miss the bus, you miss your window of opportunity on your brain growing, because your brain only grows in a dopamine-rich environment. That is, when you feel more or less positive and you're getting feedback from the outside world, that is when your brain is suited to growth. And that is part of, by the way, why kids who have medication, or even adults who have medication for ADHD, if that's combined with some intentional disciplines or therapies, they actually begin to grow that part of the brain and get better at it. As a matter of fact, this can even happen in up to 2/3 of people with ADHD, that they don't have it by the time that they enter adulthood. Because while they didn't grow as fast as other people, they were still able to, quote, grow out of it. Their brain finally caught up growing those sections. Well, you put them through the regimented system that is schooling, suddenly none of that happens. Because by the time you're a second grader, you're expected to act like a second grader in every possible way. And so if there's any part of your brain that is not, where an ordinary second grader's brain will be at, now you're just getting yelled at. So take a little kid. They can't stop trying to move around and kicking their legs because that switch in their brain hasn't turned from being able to move around to being able to think about moving around. You know, if you ask a track racer, consider this racetrack and think about how you would go through all the turns, like run it in your mind. They can run the track in their mind. And actually, if you were to attach electrodes to their legs, you could see that they're ever so slightly flexing as they imagine each step, each turn, each jump, that they're actually, their body is reciting it as their brain is reciting it, but they're not actually moving their body because their switch has been turned, and it has been since they were a little kid. Same thing for saying, imagine solving a Rubik's Cube. A person who can do that, their brain is able to, they've gained the ability to visualize without actually touching a Rubik's Cube. So all of these things are things that sometime in your childhood development, you switch from external to internal, where you no longer have to be actually doing it in order to think about it. Well, one of the very biggest things that is a source of inconvenience and that gets people in the schooling system angry with those who have neurodevelopmental disabilities is that they talk out of turn, or they're talking when they're not supposed to, even muttering to themselves, and that they can't control their body. This is because they are still trying to grow the part of their brain that will, once it is fully developed, internalize verbal speech into thinking, and will internalize movement into a different kind of thinking, into visualization. Mm-hmm. And so, if you go about it in a more free-form way, that is to say, without an expectation, all right, once you hit this age, you must have this developed, or we're moving on without you, and it doesn't matter if you do. In free-form environments, a kid will run around until one day they don't need to. A kid will talk to themselves, and then you start to see this transitionary period where they're not really talking to themselves. And by the way, if you listen to a kid talking, like we're talking 2-year-old, just babbling, they don't know what they're saying. Like, you don't know what they're saying. It sounds weird. They don't know what they're saying either. They are simply trying out the concept of thought through their mouth. It exits their mouth, and they're hearing it for the first time as it goes back into their ears. They don't have this idea of thinking about it before they say it. Saying it is how they think it. Well, you'll eventually get to a point where they're not talking to themselves as much, and you'll even see them perhaps opening their mouth as though to talk and then closing it again and not actually saying anything. And you can tell that they're pondering because they've actually taught themselves how to think inside their brain instead of outside. Well, say you enter an environment where you're not allowed to do that. Say in the first grade, it's okay if kids are kind of talking amongst themselves, but in the second grade, it's time to stop doing that, pay attention, do your homework quietly at your desk. Especially if there's an element of threat, like if you don't, you'll be in trouble. Well, somebody who has developed at an ordinary speed has already learned how to internalize speech into verbal thinking. They're able to think in terms of words and pattern. Somebody who has not developed it is not able to think entirely inside their own head. They still need external something going on in order to fully process a thought. Mm-hmm. So you hand everybody in that room a piece of homework and you say, quietly work on this at your desk. The kid with ADHD will be stuck on the quietly. And, especially if they know that they're going to get in big trouble if they talk, they're not thinking about the assignment because they are not able to think about the assignment. To think, they needed to use their mouth to externalize the information and take it back in. They're still in the process of growing their brain so that switch will flip. All they're thinking about is be quiet or I'll get in trouble. Then the teacher walks by. Why is there nothing done on this paper? Because they were spending all of their conscious energy not making noise. Mm-hmm. When they needed actually to talk to themselves to be able to finish that. And so, these are the kinds of situations that never came up before we did school in such a regimented, this year you must be like this year you must be like that kind of way, where we lost so much of that accommodation and understanding that kids grow at different speeds. And so I actually believe that not only does this make ADHD and other things way more apparent, but it may also have a lot to do with causing people to stay that way and to not grow out of it very quickly. Because you go the rest of your time in school, you're not going to go back to a time where you're allowed to talk out loud in class. Yeah. Third grade is going to be the same. Fourth grade is going to be the same, right? You go all the way to the end of high school and possibly some of college, and you're still not allowed to talk to yourself. And if you talk to yourself in public, people will give you funny looks. So you are spending an immense amount of energy trying to both think internally and to be quiet. And you never grow that section of your brain the way that it needs. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, there's also environmental factors outside of just how our society is structured. For example, I have plastic in my brain. You have plastic in your brain. We all have plastic in every cell of our body now.
Mm-hmm.
I have lead in my blood, and so do you. I have also mercury and aluminum in my blood. I have hormones and antibiotics. Like the number of things that that after the Industrial Revolution we have managed to cram into every square inch of the planet Earth. We don't know. There could be more that is causing these disabilities than there was before.
Could be.
But let us never talk in this kind of snarky, ironic way and say, oh, you know, people didn't use it. It's like, what's the big thing? You know, are you sure you really have it? It doesn't do anybody any good.
So I have two trains of thought here. The first one I wanted to say is you reminded me of like one of the. It was common in my day in schooling. You know, I'm 22 basically here, and so when I was pretty young, you know, call it elementary school age, it was not uncommon for ADHD kids to have as part of their individual support plans or ISPs to have these little like PVC phones, you know, that would like make it so that you could kind of whisper and you could hear yourself really well. And that way you could still get some of that verbal processing necessary.
Yes, right.
And like that's such a great tool. And
yeah,
I'm glad
it would
that
be a
got
little
accepted.
It'd be a little piece of plastic tubing with two bends at the ends so that you could connect your mouth directly to your ear, because that's literally what every does. Is every kid in their development is connecting their mouth to their ear until they don't need to.
Yeah. It's just like that's a great way of doing it. And like that's a really cool thing. The other train of thought, oh no, I've lost it.
Okay, I'll throw another fast one.
Yeah.
Math. People with ADHD are often notoriously bad at math. Do you know how you did math when you were in like kindergarten?
Yeah.
You would have like blocks and counters and those little plastic bears, and you'd have like, you know, the little 1 blocks, and then you'd have the little plates for 100 and little lines for 10. That was externalizing mathematical thinking.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you were visualizing 1 plus being 1 object plus 1 object, and then being told, okay, so when you see 1 object and 1 object, that's 2 objects. Memorize that idea. Let that pattern form in your brain. Well, there's a point where in your development that becomes internalized. But what if a kid still needed the math blocks, still needed that externalized information because it hasn't quite flipped the switch and entered their thinking on the inside of their head, and you take the blocks away? The result is a person who's not very good at,
Yeah.
you know, unless they're counting on their fingers.
Mm-hmm. And I will say in my own development, I developed math really, really well. I was kind of a whiz kid with it. But I remember even as early as 3, I was using an abacus. Like I knew how to use an abacus properly. Which,
Yeah.
Admittedly, that's relatively abnormal, and that's probably just because of the myriad of conditions on top of each other for myself. But that ability stayed with me, and then I helped show other kids who were struggling how to do it because I empathetically felt that they were struggling, you know? And so whenever allowed, I would always help out. I remember in school, it's not uncommon for me to be sort of put into a tutor position for some of the kids that were struggling.
And that's one of the big ways also that you can accommodate a person who has ADHD is the part of their brain that's supposed to be producing reward chemicals is significantly under functioning in that. So nothing that you do is necessarily rewarding except things that you have an intellectual interest in, or an interest in on a feeling kind of empathetic level. Mm-hmm. So if you put a person who has ADHD or autism also in an environment where it is stimulating intellectually, or where their heart is involved and they care about it, you're going to see much better results because their brain is finally able to focus finally having the amount of dopamine that it needs, the reward chemical, in order to keep on going.
Mm-hmm. And so that brings me back to something that I find kind of interesting. This is a relatively recent discovery. By relatively recent, I mean within the last like 7 years. With ADHD, for a long time it was considered, oh, they don't produce enough dopamine naturally within their system, and it would be more accurate to say, in effect, that's really what's happening. But it would be more accurate to say that they produce the same amount of dopamine as really anybody does, but they have more receptors for it in their brain, so dopamine lives for half as long because it's getting processed much faster. And so that can be why the learning becomes a struggle, and why they need stimulants, is because they don't produce enough for their brains. Produce enough in the sense of what everybody else is producing, but it's not enough for their individual needs because they have more dopamine receptors.
Right. So that segues pretty neatly into accommodation. One of the ways that you can really self-accommodate as a person who has ADHD especially, and this will also help a little bit with autism too.
Stimming. I'm doing it right now. My right leg just instinctively was bouncing up and down because it's a stim. It helps give a little bit of dopamine. It helps you use energy, which feels good, and helps you focus.
Yeah. And that's another thing that people will externally recognize when a person has autism, because they're just kind of moving around.
Yeah.
Well, that's another internalization versus externalization. You are doing something external that then feeds enjoyment back to your brain. If the part of your brain that internalizes information had fully grown concerning that particular kind of moving or thinking, you would actually be able to use your brain to just generally enjoy yourself without moving your body. But because it's underdeveloped, you need to actually move your body instead of just spending your attention. It's a little complicated, but your brain is big itself. My mic's not working. Your brain is able to stroke itself. It's able to stimulate itself and more or less keep itself interested if you have grown to the point where you have internalized that kind of, behavior, that kind of thinking. Your brain does it subconsciously. Mm-hmm. For a person who has autism or ADHD, that never internalized, and so you have to do things that are external to yourself. Mm-hmm. Another thing that's less distracting to other people and is pretty easy to do: make sure you have snacks. Keep that blood sugar up.
Yeah. Because
your brain needs more reward chemical, and eating gives good reward chemical. You just have to also be careful to make sure that you're picking things that are relatively nutritious. Mm-hmm. And, the eating habits of people with autism ADHD are often terrible because they will automatically, like, their brain kind of knows by instinct, they will focus on things that are sugary. They will focus on things that have a lot of glucose, lots of carbs, lots of sugars, because their body and really their brain is a lot happier with those. And when it's happy, it can run a lot more similarly to a person who has everything that they need. Their brain acts more like a normal person's brain while they're under the effects of good blood sugar levels. Mm-hmm. And the way that it often goes missed, you'll often find that people with ADHD or autism are actually underweight and not overweight, when really eating that unhealthily would sometimes result in obesity, because they also have the thing where they're not remembering to eat at all. So, you miss a meal and then you have a bunch of sugary snacks and it doesn't quite break even.
Yeah.
But there's also people who will end up becoming overweight on account of their brain constantly prioritizing, non-nutritious foods. So the thing is, find something nutritious, but that has, a lot of easily accessible sugars in it. It doesn't have to be processed sugar.
Apple slices is a classic for that.
apple slices, right? It's a stimulating thing to eat. It gives a lot of sugar, and
Oranges are
it's and
also really
it's
good because the
good, healthy
acids are going to
sugar,
help you with focusing.
right? Get that good, healthy sugar in you with some frequency.
Mm-hmm. Uh,
Uh,
in my experience, for instance, we're not exactly sure why, but we are looking into it. I am prone to hypoglycemia, and I didn't know this until I almost passed out while standing up a few times.
that's not enough blood sugar.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so, in realizing that I didn't have enough blood sugars and stuff, it made sense why I gravitated towards like having like sodas and stuff around, or just little things that were more sugary. Um, and then when I didn't have them, it wasn't like, oh, I must have them to survive. My brain wasn't consciously doing that. It wasn't even necessarily unconsciously doing it. But then I started getting my symptoms a lot more when I was in places where that was more restricted. That I couldn't quote unquote self medicate instinctively in that way. And then we actually confirmed that when I got blood tested to make sure I didn't have diabetes, because my mother had diabetes and I am overweight. I'm like 300 pounds, but I'm 6'5", so like I wear it well, but I am a fat dude. I fully own that and make
I
jokes about it.
finally, I finally just hit a healthy weight. I'm also 6'5", but I just hit 200, and I had been underweight for pretty much my whole life.
Oof.
Because I'm being so intentional about eating healthy now,
Yeah.
and eating enough and often enough.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it definitely comes out in different ways. We're different sides of that same coin.
Yeah. I didn't realize you were also 6'5". That's kind of interesting. But yeah, and so basically they did blood testing and they're like, oh, turns out you have the opposite problem. Your A1C is actually a little bit low, which means it was still within normal, so it's not like it needed to be medicated per se. But they were like, yeah, just make sure you have more sugary stuff and you should be fine. Because just my blood is processing the sugar faster.
Yeah.
So
Another thing people will frequently recommend, I'll tell you how to make this work and why people will often recommend it and why it doesn't usually work. People will often recommend, if you can't remember times, have a clock. If you can't remember appointments, have a calendar. If you can't remember things to do at certain times, set timers and reminders. If you can't remember that you need to do this, right? They'll give you a whole slew of organizational tools
mm-hmm.
and say, have a plan or have a timer, have a this, have a that. Here's the thing. The reason that this often doesn't work is I am tired. I am already trying to do thousands of tasks to hundreds of thousands of tasks in a day, and every single one of them is on purpose. I am unable to form habits because habit forming behavior, you form a habit by your brain being happy while you do something.
Mm-hmm.
And if your brain is not happy while you do something, you will not form habits. That's a very brief way of putting it. Really, it's a fascinating little piece of brain chemistry. Your brain doesn't know the difference between being happy while doing something and being happy because you're doing something. It will associate enjoyment with whatever activity you happen to be doing if it has all the chemicals that it wants to have.
Mm-hmm.
So if I start brushing my teeth and I have a neurotypical brain, meaning that I'm automatically producing a normal amount of reward chemicals and then taking on a normal amount of reward chemical back, into the receptors, my brain will say, I am brushing my teeth and I am happy. Oh, I am brushing my teeth, therefore I am happy. I do that like a month, and suddenly I start getting a little notification ping in the back of my head at 7 p.m. Hey, brush your teeth, it'll make you happy. That's a habit.
Yeah.
ADHD people struggle a lot with making habits because nothing they do makes them happy.
Yeah.
So you need to introduce some kind of external way of increasing your dopamine. ADHD people and people with autism will often get lost in their heads, often their own little worlds, because they're using their intellectual brain to stimulate itself and give reward chemicals. They're thinking about things and focusing on topics and ideas because that ends up satisfying their need for enjoyment. But when you're using your intellectual brain, you get worse at doing whatever you're trying to do with your body.
Yeah.
And so, you know, you feel okay, the same amount of okay that everybody else feels when they are not thinking really hard about something. But they're able to do a task while you're not able to do a task because you're too busy thinking. So it's again that situation of, hey, I'm not doing something in a different way that's equally as good. I'm doing the best that I can because I have something that's broken in my head. You know, not a difference, but actually a disability. This makes me less able to do things. Well, anyway, that's more or less the way that habits develop. And you need a certain amount of reward to help stave off getting really, really tired.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to not have too many tasks to do in a day without a proper amount of reward. Otherwise, you're going to get incredibly stressed and incredibly tired. So if somebody looks at me, a person who has a disabling level of ADHD, and says, well, look, if you struggle with time, you know, just set all these timers and set all these reminders and, you know, have a planner and make sure you check it regularly. These are all tasks on top of the hundreds of thousands of tasks I'm also doing consciously all the time.
Yeah.
I'm already doing so much that it exhausts me. Now you might say, well, they save time, don't they? I mean, they help. They make things more simple and streamlined and effective. But beginning to do them, even just the process of setting a timer, means keeping the thought in mind that I'm about to set a notification for, which is a task,
Mm-hmm.
initiating the task of taking my phone out of my pocket, maintaining that task long enough to get my phone open, maintaining the task of getting to my notifications app without getting distracted by anything else that's on the screen, which is going to be hard because part of what phones are made for is to put things on screen that you're supposed to grab your attention, like other notifications or texts or whatever, right? Get to it, put in, you know, come up with a time for when I want to be remote, put that in, and then put my phone away. I said, that what? Like, what's the big deal? That's ridiculous. I had to think about every step of that. And if I don't consciously do it, I will fail.
Yeah. And
so that was like 8 to 10 tasks to set a notification in order to remind me to do one task. You can see how this ends up being ineffective. But here's how to make it work.
Because, yeah, for instance, I learned how to do it in a way that was very constructive for me, though it was difficult at first, for sure. And before we continue, I do want to own up for the audience. Yeah, I'm part of the reason that we were a little bit late recording this, because I didn't get ready for it until 30 minutes after we were supposed to start. Like, it happens.
That also happened to me, as a matter of fact.
It's like, it happens, and the key thing is to not beat yourself up over it, and just be like, it happened, how can I implement a strategy to avoid it in the future? Right. And that's all you can do with it.
So here, and this is kind of the great way that Dr. Barkley's theory all ties back into itself and becomes very positive and uplifting. Just because your brain didn't grow in the way it was supposed to when you were a kid doesn't mean that you can't grow those centers now. Mm-hmm. You still have time, and your brain is still flexible, unless, you know, you're somewhere over the age of about 30, where your brain gets a little less plastic, able to change shape. Mm-hmm. You still have time. You're not like somebody born with 3 fingers who can't grow the extra finger and the thumb. It is actually possible to develop as a kid does, even though you're now closer to adulthood. But here's the thing. You need the same conditions as a kid had. You need a dopamine-rich environment. And so here's the thing.
It's important to remember that, like, yes, you can definitely grow them, and not everybody will reach the full point, like, you know, the full point of being, you know, basically quote unquote typical again. The reality,
non-diagnosable.
Yeah, the reality is you just need to put in the effort you can put in and grow as much as you can grow, because at the end of that day, you're better than you were the day before. Yeah. And that's important.
Yep. If it helps you more to think about, I just want today to be better than it would be if I weren't trying,
Yeah.
do that. And if you want to think about, man, I would like 3 years from now to walk into a doctor's office and they're no longer able to diagnose me. Hey, that may or may not be possible, but it's worth having hope about that. These things will affect you your whole life, but the negative symptoms, the worst of it, are not necessarily a life sentence. So here's how you get the same environment that you had when you were a kid, because a kid grows out of the state that you are now in, and you possibly can too. You need a dopamine rich environment. You need an environment that is rewarding, and you need external reminders. People who have this instinct to tell people, hey, well, if you struggle with social situations, read a book. They'll say that to autistic kids, read a book about how to do better in social situations. I actually did that a lot. It helps. When I was a kid, I read up on a lot of communication theory, and now I'm better at it than most people are. Yeah. And they'll say to a kid with ADHD, well, get a planner, get a clock, get a whatever. That ends up being exhausting, but it doesn't have to be if you are getting dopamine from somewhere. And so one way that you can get a fair amount is exercise, sunlight, diet, some of these obvious things. Putting in regular snacks that have easily accessible sugars, nutrients, trying to get a good night's sleep as best as you can. At least turn off the phone and at least turn the lights off and get into bed and try. Those things will all help your brain produce more of that reward chemical so that you are having a more positive environment. Not necessarily a positive external environment, but a positive environment inside your brain. And then as you take on a planner or as you read a book or whatever, you start internalizing more of that information. And the longer that you do that, you don't end up necessarily becoming dependent on a planner. I mean, it's okay to be dependent on a planner, but you need that reward. Another thing that you can possibly do, and this is an area of huge stigma for a lot of people, is medication. Stimulant medications do work. Adderall does work for ADHD of pretty much every form. There's a bunch of others, Concerta, Vyvanse. Try them out with your doctor. Get a correct dosage. Go back and get your dosage fixed if you're getting side effects you don't want. Ask about getting a different one. Try these things out, because what they're doing is they're stimulants. They make your brain produce more reward chemical, which is what you need, not only to get along well each day and not get tired, but also what you need in order to grow your brain. And so if you combine external factors, keeping a clock in every room, having a calendar on your phone, whatever you can do to put information outside of yourself until your brain finally gets it, combine that with a happy brain, and you get a brain that grows in the areas that are undergrown. And they've done studies on this saying, if I have a kid go through an intensive therapy with external reminders, how long does it help? They're like, the noticeable effects of having gone through that therapy will last for about 6 months. Here's the thing when you're on a medication. The noticeable effects of being on your medication end the exact millisecond that you metabolize the last grain of that medication for the day. So you get like extended release Adderall. It's a little hard to get because it's a controlled substance. The government makes sure that not just anybody can get it.
Yeah.
That extended release stuff has special coating so that some of it will release at one time, some of it will finally metabolize another time. So that gives you like 8 hours. The moment that 8th hour is up, you are no longer benefiting from it whatsoever. So on the face of it, one might say that going through an external therapy or program or using external tools ends up being a lot more effective for a lot longer term than medication does. But the sweet spot, and the thing that I think people really need to hear, is do both. Get yourself a brain that is rewarding you for doing things that should be rewarding and would be else. Yeah. Then add in external reminders and factors, and you're going to get growth. You're going to get better.
And
That is what the leading doctors are saying right now.
yeah, and something that I've thought about is you can take advantage of things in your life. An example, I find silence really upsetting. So like when things are completely silent and there's no sound whatsoever, bothers me. So I need to have a little bit of sound somewhere. The sound of a box fan is associated to so many good childhood memories that sound of a box fan going at night just makes me happy and makes it easier for me to fall asleep. Like, you take advantage of the associations in your brain. One thing I do often is I will actually leave my phone on with like some YouTube going until I fall asleep. And it does help me fall asleep faster because I am prone to insomnia as it's part of my stress disorder. So, or insomniac sleeping. But it's just take advantage of the associations your brain has made. And you can twist them, quote unquote, twist them to be beneficial instead of something that would be bad, right? The silence of night as you're trying to fall asleep,
right,
makes you morbidly self-reflect or whatever. Suddenly you can basically twist that association by then having something else take its place, or have a sound that helps you fall asleep or something.
Right, and that's that habit forming thing again. That concept. You were in a place where your brain was happy while you were listening to a box fan at night as a kid. And because of that, your brain created an association. If I hear a box fan, I'm happy. So now if you're on a box fan, it provides reward and it makes you calmer.
Yeah.
Learn all your little tricks. And man, one of the great things is, people with autism and people with ADHD, who actually have it diagnosable, will often be super reflective, introspective, and able to think about all these little patterns and connections and just have a lot of fun with taking on information. And I think that's part of the trouble on social media, the exchanges of information between people who like making stuff up and people who really like information. I think that might be part of why there's so much misinformation about ADHD, because people who really have it get obsessed with collecting and then redistributing information. The people who don't have it just, add a lot of complete nonsense into the mix.
Yeah.
But you can actually take advantage of your brain likes to think. Your intellectual brain actually has a whole lot more fun than the average person because it's taught itself to enjoy thinking consciously. A person who has a more typical brain does not enjoy thinking about everything all the time and actually wants a quiet space to take a relaxing bath, to not think about anything. Their brain enjoys doing most of its work subconsciously, and they like to stop thinking. You like to think. Take advantage of that. Use that thinking power to learn yourself and learn every trick that you can to self-accommodate.
Hence why I'm really big on mindfulness and self-awareness and just being aware. Admittedly, that can go too far. Example, I'm prone to something called morbid self-reflection. So, if I think about myself and things that I'm living life with a little too much, or maybe applying standards to myself that I couldn't reach anyway, then that can lead to despair. But I can also use that to be aware, to be mindful of what's going on, and I can take it from being morbid to just self-reflection. And it's important to do that, I think.
Yeah. Well, this is going to be a bear to edit.
Yeah, this is a minute and 39 minutes. Or an hour and 39 minutes. So I think that's probably about where we're going to end. I got to be going soon anyway, so it works out. I think that was a pretty natural stopping place.
Yeah, awesome.
This was a fantastic discussion, and
it's been wonderful, Billy.
Yeah, I'm for sure going to send this around to a lot of people, because I think we covered a lot of important topics in a intellectual and empathetic way.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for putting this on, and look forward to working again with you soon.
Absolutely. We have a lot of fun when we collab. All right. Adios.
Night, everybody.